So where we left off yesterday was sort of the aftermath as far as casualties and the destruction of World War II. We talked about the end of the war, basically in Japan, that ends all of the fighting more or less in World War II with the surrender of Japan in August of 1945. So there's a lot to be done in the wake of the destruction of sort of putting the world back together, honestly, after such great amount of destruction and death and loss. Before we even get to the end of World War II, as a matter of fact, this comes about during a conference that's taking place in April of 1945 in San Francisco, where 50 leaders or diplomats from about 51 countries, I believe, met in this conference in San Francisco. So before even the surrender of Germany, there's discussion of what the sort of post-World War II world is going to look like and how the world is going to navigate that. Because they see the end coming, by spring of 1945, it's obvious that the Allies are going to win, that United States, Great Britain, Soviet Union, China are going to be the victors in World War II. So they come up with this idea for the United Nations. And the charter there, sort of the mission statement of the United Nations includes, there's a little more to it, but this is some of the important parts here. Maintaining international peace and security, protecting human rights, delivering humanitarian aid, and upholding international law. So it's still in effect, right? The United Nations is headquartered in New York City. And, it much like the League of Nations has very limited power to do much of anything when it comes to any individual country. But there are times that it has interceded when it comes to certain crises, and obviously when it comes to providing aid and things like that, it does a good job. The idea, largely surrounding the United Nations, was the idea of preventing another crisis like we saw in World War II, to perhaps intervene before we get to that level of destruction. As a result, the League of Nations, which is actually still around until 1946, is finally dissolved. That goes away in 1946, and the United Nations sort of steps into its place. So one of the things, there's all these different sort of, councils and different sort of organizations underneath the United Nations, but sort of the primary body is the UN Permanent, I should put permanent in there, UN Permanent Security Council. So that is consisted of what's seen as the victors of World War II. So Britain, France, the United States, China, at its conception, the Soviet Union, that's now Russia. But these 5 countries are sort of, the head of the UN Security Council, and they are seen as sort of those victors that work together to defeat Japan, Italy, and Germany. So the thing about this Security Council is that each one of these members has the veto power, individual veto power, to overrule any type of resolution that's made by the United Nations. So if something comes to a vote by the nations themselves, Britain or France or China or Russia, any one of those could go veto, don't like that. And you could see in today's world where that's a little bit of an issue when it comes to getting anything done with the United Nations, because while you have 3 of those countries that are, fairly close allies, you have 2 others that have been in opposition to those other 3 for most of those, 76 years or so. of the or 77 years of the existence of the United Nations. The other problem that's often that was also an issue with the League of Nations, and particularly with what's becoming more the United States, has often been the case with China, is this idea of interfering with the country's sovereignty. So the U.S. right now is very critical of the United Nations. Anytime it passes some type of resolution or something that wants the United States to do something, you have a lot of critics of that saying that messes with our sovereignty. The sovereignty being the capability and ability and authority to rule and govern, right? And as a country, we have sovereignty over ourselves. The United States has sovereignty over its people, and we don't want another entity, whether another country or organization, to interfere with that. And that, often means that, there's same thing. I mean, there's critics in Britain and France and Russia as far as anything that the United Nations does. But that's often the sort of pushback whenever the United States or United Nations offers some type of resolution or suggestion of policy. But it was created once again to attempt to prevent the type of crisis that we saw during World War II. So looking at the state of the world directly after World War II, and I'll start with a little background on our allies here, particularly the Soviet Union in one camp, and the United States is sort of the leader of the other camp, with Britain, France, and some of our other allies as a part of that. So I've mentioned this along the way when we started this, talking about World War II. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was a very unlikely ally in the fight against Germany, Japan, and Italy. And a lot of that has to do with their ideology. A lot of that has to do with personalities. But as we know, we start talking about the rise of Hitler's Germany, that the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with them, that they weren't going to interfere with whatever Germany did when it came to Europe. They even invaded Poland on the other side alongside of Germany. And basically, they became an ally because we had a common enemy once Germany attacked the Soviet Union. And the same thing with Japan, that was very aggressive and hostile towards the Soviet Union in the Pacific. So that made us allies through the war. But through that, we were still at ideological odds. So the United States is a Western liberal democracy with a capitalistic economy. So I've mentioned this too, as far as Western liberal democracy, supporting and promoting individual rights, civil liberties, the separation of powers within our government, a democratically elected government, right? So it's a democratic process that elects our lawmakers and our chief executive president. And as far as capitalism goes, right, it's rooted in this idea that we believe in the private ownership of business. So private individuals own the means of production in our country by and large. We also value and promote, free trade among other countries and within our own country. So, private business, that's sort of the idea of capitalism. In reality, we're a mixed economy. Obviously, we have, various types of social programs that are run by the government. There are organizations and, like the post office, that's a government institution. It's run by the government. There's been, others kind of come and go. But even when it comes to sort of, the Democrat Party, which tends more towards more regulation of business, there's still a belief in capitalism. They still believe in the private ownership of businesses. but they might, think about, more regulation or more taxes. Communism, on the complete opposite spectrum, is a form of socialism. The brief, simple definition of socialism is that the state or the country owns largely the means of production. There's very few, if any, privately owned businesses. There is a great deal of regulation. And with communism being sort of a particular form of that, it sort of encompasses both an economic system and a political system. So, a few aspects of communism is, of course, in any of these countries where you have a communist state. So today, North Korea and China, for example, and of course, during this time, Soviet Union, you only have one political party. It is the Communist Party that is in charge. And while so many of these, current or former communist countries have stuff about democracy or republics in their, in the title of their country, very few have actually had some type of democratic process involved. Excuse me. Communism as a form of socialism, instead of sort of the state necessarily itself owning the means of production, it's supposed to be the people that own the means of production. That word communism, you think about community. So there's supposed to be sort of this communal idea of leadership and governance. The way it was technically supposed to work is that, you have these Soviets instead of states that are linked to the Communist Party. And they have this sort of council that governs. It's supposed to be like the sort of wise council that governs the state or the Soviets. Another aspect of communism is that it tends to be less. It has something similar to fascism, where it is the state and country above the individual, right? It's all about the good of the state. And if you hear any of the old rhetoric that comes out of the Soviet Union, you'll understand. You'll notice that. The few other things that kind of separates it from Western ideologies, that sort of democratic principle. It's an atheistic sort of doctrine, and not that all communists are atheists, but that's something that sort of rubbed the West the wrong way. We have the separation of church and state within our government, but by and large, the West tends to be Christian or religious, either way. And so that idea of sort of an atheistic society didn't set well with, the Western states. And when I say the West, I'm kind of talking about the United States and our sort of current allies, Great Britain, France, right? It's all sort of similar ideologies when it comes to government and economics that we share. Another issue is the fact that communism within its doctrine is supposed to be a global revolution. The end state of the world is to be all communist, which means that's going to roll over, the rest of the world. Everyone's going to become communist. That's the end state that's in the doctrine. So obviously that's going to cause a problem as well. And we have issues with communism throughout American history since it sort of appears in the mid 1800s. Around union, when workers started to organize and unionize, we had these kind of situations where it allowed communists to sort of gain some influence within those, because communism was largely about workers, laborers, the proletariat, right? Sort of the people who are the producers. So there was several sort of panics within our country well before we get to the end of World War II to sort of out, communists, to keep them from gaining any traction within the United States. And then the final issue when it comes to particularly the Soviet Union and the rest of the Allies was the personality, Joseph Stalin, who was the premier, the leader of the Communist Party of that time, who was every bit as bad, if not worse, than Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. He was responsible for probably millions of deaths of his own people that he had murdered, who were sort of dissidents or possibly political rivals, to help consolidate his power. It was called the liquidation. He liquidated people. And there's a very famous quote by him, something about, you kill one person, it's a tragedy. You kill millions, it's a statistic. So obviously they can't trust him. There's just, it's very unsure what's going to be the future with working with the Soviet Union when we're getting to the end of World War II. And of course, the United States kept its own secrets as well. Things like the atomic bomb, it tried to hide from Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. So that gets us to the occupation of Europe. Well, in particular, Germany. So after the German surrender, the Allies set up these occupation zones. What I have on the map there, those different colors all together represent what was Germany, or is Germany, the borders. And they had these occupation zones set up with these sort of provisional governments. Now, Germany was destroyed, economically crushed. They were going to need assistance to rebuild. And this time, instead of leaving them to their own devices, where they, install some other type of authoritarian dictator, the Allies are going to have a hand in it. They looked at history and it's like, okay, maybe we need to be involved in this because they are so economically devastated. They are so physically destroyed. We're going to set up provisional governments. The green shaded area was Great Britain. They were basically in control of that part of Germany. The blue was France, the gold, the United States, and the red was the Soviet Union. And the idea was we get them stable. We basically get them demilitarized. We kind of dismantle their military. And then we start helping them economically until we can basically, dissolve our occupational areas and they can unite under one government. So that was the idea behind the occupation there. So sort of like what we did with the Civil War, with the era of Reconstruction. We had military set up that was helping to govern and trying to get what had been the Confederacy back on its feet economically. As a matter of fact, I think the United States probably did a better job with Germany and Japan than they did with the South, but that's a different story. Now, one big problem area within this, you'll see there's this little middle part in what was the Soviet occupied area. And you'll see we have those little colors of the United States and France and Great Britain. So that is Berlin, which was also occupied by all four of the Allies. They had their own little zones that they were in control of because Berlin was the capital city, during World War II. So you have one little area by the United States, one by France, one by Great Britain, and then the Soviet Union controls another side of Berlin, which becomes a very contentious point early on. So after a few years pass and tensions are kind of on the rise between the Soviet Union and the other allies, and the United States, Britain, and France are going to institute a new currency they're going to bring back the German Deutschmark on those western side of Germany. So bring back a German currency. The Soviet Union was very unhappy with that. They wanted to be able to control the currency and the monetary side of Germany. So, as sort of a means of protest, the Soviet Union blocks the other allies' ability to deliver goods via road, canal, or train into West Berlin, the side of Berlin that was occupied by those three allies. They were, this was sort of a protest. They were going to, didn't want the Deutschmark to reappear. So they weren't going to allow those allies access. And often this is seen as sort of one of the first crises of the Cold War. We hadn't really, thought about a long-term sort of ideological battle with the Soviet Union yet, but this is one of those things where the Soviet Union are kind of, planting their feet, and so do the other allies. So this crisis lasts from about June 1948 into May 1949. So they wouldn't allow, and it was basically trying to bring the other allies back to the sort of a negotiating table. They were going to sort of demoralize those West Berliners when they couldn't, receive any type of aid. So because they were really relying at this point, Germans were relying on assistance, food, clothes, all of that coming from the Allies while they tried to rebuild. So this results in what's known as the Berlin Airlift. And it was a mass humanitarian aid project that was mostly done by Great Britain and more so by the United States to drop aid into Berlin via airplane. They would, and the result was, over that course of time, there were so many planes over Berlin that it averaged out to about one cargo plane every 30 seconds over the course of that almost year, that aid was being delivered to West Berlin because of the Soviet blockade. So, and it also shows that the Soviets were only going to go so far, because they could have just started shooting down cargo planes, but they knew that was going to be cause a much worse conflict. So all this aid is getting delivered, trying to bolster the morale of West Berliners. And then finally, the occupation zones are dissolved, leaving Germany to theoretically reunite. And what ends up happening here is then you have two Germanys. You have what's known as the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. So that what is represented in that green, gold, and blue areas does reunite and becomes West Germany. It is aligned with Great Britain, France, and the United States. And we get the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, which never becomes a part of the Soviet Union. It's basically a puppet state, though. It takes direction from the Soviet Union. They are in lockstep with each other when it comes to, policy and diplomacy and whatever it may be. So they are hostile towards the West and West Germany. The entire time that East Germany and West Germany exist until they're unified in 1990 when the Berlin Wall comes down, Berlin is still occupied by the US, Great Britain, and France. That West Berlin remains free and remains basically part of West Germany, so to speak. And eventually, to prevent East Berliners from leaving East Berlin and escaping to West Berlin, there is a wall installed to separate the city in early 1960s. So at this time, there's nothing. Like, you could just walk right over into East Berlin. Nothing's really stopping you. But as time goes on, they realize that people are trying to flee the sort of Soviet-controlled, East German government. There's a young man in the 80s that worked for the KGB named Vladimir Putin, who spent a lot of time in Berlin in those days. KGB was the intelligence agency of the Soviet Union, and where he got sort of his start as a in government, I guess you could say, working for the KGB. He was, I believe, in Berlin when the wall came down in 1990. We'll talk about that later, though. So anyway, this is how you get set up with a standoff in Europe now between these two sides. And the idea of the Cold War, that term comes from the idea that the guns stayed cold, that your two main belligerents, the Soviet Union and the United States, never actually faced off directly against each other. They never fought each other. There was, of course, an ideological and cultural battle that comes about in several ways. We'll talk about that later. And there was plenty of proxy wars where the two regimes sided with two other regimes and either supported or opposed, which we'll talk about here in a minute as well. So that's the state of Europe. And along the way, there's a giant aid package that comes out of the United States to help rebuild not just Germany, but Europe in general. It's called the Marshall Plan. And it was created by George C. Marshall, who was Secretary of State, and had been a famous general, one of the big wigs during the war in the Army. And part of the idea there is to try to stave off the potential of communism taking over Europe by offering aid to help get Europe back on its feet after World War II. So that takes care of Europe. So what we have next then is the occupation in Asia. So first off, the United States is occupying Japan with some help from Britain, but there's really no other allies that are really involved in that. And that lasts for about 7 years, from 1945 to 1952. They dismantle the Japanese army, really sort of hamstring them as far as being able to conduct war again. Even to this day, Japan does not have what they will call an army. They have what they call a defense force. So if they were attacked, they have a means of protecting themselves, but they do not have a standing offensive army. It's getting to the point now that we have sort of asked Japan to maybe invest a little more in their military, particularly because of sort of the threat of China, to sort of strengthen Japan. And of course, there needs to be economic rehabilitation in Japan as well, because there's tons and tons and tons of destruction, as we talked about with the firebombing of cities and the destruction, and the sort of long economic decline as a part of the war, and the means in which we fought the war to sort of speed that up, so it would help bring Japan to the table as well. So the United States is there to help rebuild, same way they are doing in Europe and in particular Germany. One of the problems with Japan, as it surrendered and is moving into this sort of rehabilitation, is the fact that it had several colonies and was in control of large parts of Asia. So, for example, we have Vietnam, which they had occupied during the 30s and 40s. There had to be some sort of occupation there by allies as well to, for one, accept the surrender of Japanese soldiers that were still there. So they separated Vietnam into two portions at the 17th parallel. I don't have a map here. I have a map of Korea, but just about in half of the country. So it was supposed to be China that was accepting the surrender of soldiers in the north, and the other allies who were accepting, surrender of soldiers in the south. The other issue with Vietnam was that before Japan had overrun it, it had been a colony of France, and technically was still part of a colony of France under what we call French Indochina. That also included Cambodia and Laos. This will blow up around the mid-1950s as Vietnam seeks independence. But just this sort of power vacuum created by the defeat of Japan and France's inability to retake control because they had plenty of issues as far as the war is concerned, doesn't really have the means to govern and reinstate itself in those colonies, and it opened up some opportunities for several characters to try to take control of Vietnam. One of those is Ho Chi Minh, who's going to lead North Vietnam. But this is starting to take shape, and a lot of that is due to the power vacuum that's created once Japan is defeated, and there's turmoil, in Southeast Asia at that point as people sort of are jockeying for power. The next big issue, though, before Vietnam really becomes a concern, is Korea, and it's the same type of issue. So Japan had annexed Korea, and it became part of Japan basically as a colony. The Korean people were badly abused and mistreated under Japanese rule. So the same thing's happening here. They have to occupy Korea to get it back on its feet and accept the surrender of soldiers and govern and provide some aid until Korea is ready to govern itself. There's another separation into occupation zones. Somebody just looked at sort of the middle of Korea. It's like, oh yeah, 38th parallel, that looks good. We'll just split it right there in the middle. And that becomes later the demilitarized zone. But so at that 38th parallel, 38th degrees latitude, we separate the two sides. So North Korea is occupied by, guess who? China and the Soviet Union. And in the south, you have the United States. And this, of course, starts around the same time, around 1945. This is all happening sort of all together here. So in 1948, there's two governments created within those two zones. You have the Republic of Korea, and that is, there's a democratic vote for the leader, I believe, and Syngman Rhee becomes the leader of the Republic of Korea, South Korea as we know it today. And then this all happened in, I think the Syngman Rhee and the Republic of Korea was formed in August of 1948. And then a week or two later, in very early September, you get the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is North Korea, formed, just a couple weeks after that. So, and the leader there is Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of Kim Jong-un, who is the leader today. And in between that, it was Kim Jong-un's father and Kim Il-sung's son, Kim Il-jong, who was the leader after the death of Kim Il-sung. So we have a pro-communist government in the north and a pro-democratic capitalist government in the south. So these two areas are still occupied. There's still U.S. soldiers and personnel in South Korea through this time. And then in 1950, it breaks out into war. When North Korean forces are attempting to unify the peninsula under the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and they invade South Korea. And it was bad. They rolled right across that 38th parallel and pushed what little bit of Allied forces and what little bit of the South Korean army there was at the time back to what's called the Pusan perimeter, which is a very small area in South Korea. I think it was right around here, down here. And those forces were just barely hanging on. South Korea almost fell to North Korea in those first few months of the Korean War. The United States starts to mobilize again and delivering aid and weapons and everything. This actually becomes a UN campaign. The United Nations sides with South Korea and the United States in this war. Of course, there's not a United Nations army or anything like that, but they are siding with the United States here. Obviously, China and the Soviet Union are not. And fighting goes on for about 3 years. Once the United States and South Korea and the few allies that we had there as well, Canada and Great Britain and whatnot, finally get their feet under them and are ready to fight back. They push the North Korean forces all the way back to China at one point. And then there's another offensive where China enters the war, obviously on the side of North Korea, and pushes the United States and South Korea back to right around the 38th parallel, where there's basically a stalemate. So it was like North Korea first charging down, then excuse me, the US and South Korea charging back, and almost there were suggestions that we should go ahead and invade China at that point. There was, of course, discussion of using atomic weapons and all of that. None of that happened, of course. And then finally, things sort of leveled out, and there was a stalemate towards the end. And then an armistice was signed in 1953. So there has never been a peace treaty between North and South Korea. So technically, they are still at war today. And routinely we'll hear some talk about North Korea and Kim Jong-un, being very hostile in the area, of course, always towards South Korea or Japan, and they are a nuclear power, so to speak. Now they have produced nuclear weapons. The effectiveness of those, I'm not sure. Their missile technology is not particularly great, but we have to deal with them as such as a nuclear power. And it's often referred to North Korea as the Hermit Kingdom, because we know so little about what goes on inside North Korea today. It's a very, very closed society. The leader, of course, there's only been 3. It's certainly a form of a dictatorship, and there's almost the leader, whether it was whether it was Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Il, or Kim Jong Un, are basically almost deified, meaning that they're almost given this sort of godlike status. There's these sort of myths that have been built around them with the North Korean people. Kim Jong Il, for example, apparently took up golf, and the first time he played golf, he shot an 18, which means that he got a hole-in-one on every hole. which no one has ever done before, as far as I know. So he got bored and he gave it up because he had perfected golf his first time out. It's those kind of just crazy kind of myths. And again, we just don't know a whole lot. We know that they're dirt poor. We know that the North Korean people suffer from the stories that we get of people that actually defect and actually make it to South Korea. And I should have, there's another great image. There's a nighttime image from either a satellite or from the International Space Station that's taken of the Korean Peninsula. And you can tell how underdeveloped North Korea is next to South Korea, because South Korea at night is all lit up, like all the way across the peninsula. You can very easily see the outline of South Korea. But north of the border of South Korea, there's just darkness, like there's nothing there. And this is, again, one of the primary situations that have come out of World War II, where we have the situation between this tension that has never been resolved between North and South Korea. And this all was a product of the decisions that were made and the way things were administered, and the support for different political camps during or shortly after World War II. And, you know, once in a while, we'll get a threat from North Korea that they're going to fire a missile or they're doing a missile test. And that's just been kind of commonplace now for South Korea. They just kind of know that they got a crazy uncle that lives up above them, that likes to make threats from time to time and acts all crazy. And it's been very difficult for any Western power to make form a relationship with North Korea. For one reason, of course, is also because their close relationship with China. So, but that is sort of the situation that we get from what occurs after the war in the 4 to 5 years once Japan surrenders. The other thing here, once we get to the Korean War, it is certainly determined that we are in a Cold War with the Soviet Union and largely communism. There's no really turning back at that point. It's very obvious that there's not going to be any real working diplomatically with China and the Soviet Union at that point. So this really entrenches what's going to happen for the next 40 or so, almost 40 years in the world. So that, I believe, yep, that's what I have as far as finishing occupation of Asia and Germany, and what is often referred to as the bipolar world of the Cold War, that sets the stage for a lot of the conflict that's going to occur for the next almost 40 years. And still, even after that, it resounds today. There are still issues because of that, particularly with North and South Korea, things with China, Japan, all of that. So wrapping up here before we take a break before language arts. Any questions on any of that as far as occupation and sort of the division of the world that started after World War II? No? Okay. Mariama, I think I mentioned about, you mentioned, asking about some books and study guides and stuff. Did you happen to mention anything to Rachel today?
No.
Okay. From what I kind of investigated, as far as like study materials and books, anything by Kaplan Publishing, Kaplan, is very reliable. And they usually do a pretty good job of making sure that they stick with sort of what is on the test, right? They're very good at sort of knowing exactly what you need to prepare for, and they have good study materials. McGraw-Hill is another one that I mentioned yesterday, so just kind of reinforcing that. I know Nilda has gone to the library before and has finds a lot of good resources. So, you know, if you're not wanting to like invest any money in anything or anything, you can always go and see what the library has. And, you know, by and large, most of the stuff the library is going to have, whether it's, you know, Kaplan or some other, you know, study material, they're usually pretty good. They're usually really reliable.
Okay.
Yeah. And then as a, excuse me, before I let you guys go for a minute, when we get, you know, through our the rest of the lessons here, probably beginning of August, maybe even a little closer than that, maybe before we get into August, we will start going through some practice tests where you're going to get to see actually, you know, exactly what the questions look like on the test, because I have a few sample tests that we'll go through. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, let's go ahead and take us about 10 minutes. Let's go ahead and just go, let's say one, having trouble with math today, 120. Let's just go on to 120. That's about a 14-minute break. And I'll see you guys 20 after. We're going to do some character traits, feelings, and motivations today for RLL reading. So I'll see you guys there in about 14 minutes. All right, bye-bye.